Everything the Cedar Kept. Chapter 1. The Summer. The Locusts were quiet. The summer Delia Vargas learned she was someone else's daughter began with a monsoon cloud and a cedar chest she almost didn't open. She was standing on the porch of her grandmother's adobe house on the north edge of Taos when the cloud appeared. The first serious one of the season, boiling up dark and silver over Taos Mountain as if the mountain had grown impatient and decided to make its own weather. She had been in New Mexico for exactly 4 hours. Her car was still loaded with half the boxes she'd promised herself she'd unpack before dark. The late afternoon sun caught the sage flats below the house and turned them the color of old honey. And somewhere behind her in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed the same note it had hummed her entire childhood, and it was all so familiar and so wrong that she had to hold the porch railing with both hands. Wrong wasn't quite the word. Rosa Vargas had been gone since February. The house had not changed. The blue-painted door still faced the road in the old Taos tradition, the kind of blue that locals called the color of protection, a hue borrowed from the sky at that precise hour before full dark. The vigas still jutted from the upper walls like the fingers of hands pressed outward. The hollyhocks Rosa had planted along the fence in 1987 were coming in again, because hollyhocks do not grieve, they simply grow, and Delia found that both comforting and slightly offensive. She had come to settle the estate. That was what she told people. She told her principal she needed the summer away after a hard year. And the year had been hard. 23 kindergartners and a classroom aide who cried more easily than the children, and a broken heating system that ran 3 months too long. She told her best friend Becca she needed the quiet and the altitude. She told her father Tomás she wanted to honor Rosa properly, go through her things, take her time. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that Delia Vargas was 29 years old, and somewhere in the last 2 years, she had misplaced herself. She had lost the engagement, the ring, the plans, the version of her future she had constructed with a careful and ultimately misguided love. And she had managed that loss with the competence and quiet dignity that everyone seemed to expect of her, which meant she had managed it by not quite feeling it. And now all that careful management had compounded into something she couldn't name. She went to church on Sundays. She read her Bible some mornings. She prayed the way a person sets a table out of habit, going through the motions of something that once held meaning, hoping the meaning would find its way back to the place where she'd left it. It hadn't. Not yet. The San Francisco de Asís church bell rang the 5 o'clock hour somewhere below her in the direction of Ranchos de Taos, its tone traveling up through the sage-scrubbed air with that clarity that high desert sound has, as if the altitude stripped everything unnecessary away and left only the essential note. Delia closed her eyes and listened until the last vibration gave out. She went inside. The house smelled of piñón and old wood, and something sweet she had never been able to identify. Maybe the dried chamomile Rosa kept in a bowl on the windowsill. Maybe just the smell of a life lived slowly and well. The furniture was exactly as it had always been. The heavy wooden table with its 4 mismatched chairs. The painting of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that Rosa had bought from a man at the Taos Pueblo flea market in 1994. The oval mirror in the hallway, where Delia had practiced her first day of school faces as a little girl. She moved through the room slowly, touching things and letting them go. In her grandmother's bedroom, she found the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, exactly where it had always been. She had seen it 1,000 times. As a child, she'd been told it held keepsakes, quilts, the careful accumulations of a long life, and she'd never had reason to look inside it beyond a curious 6-year-old's one brief investigation. Quilts, yes, and a smell so deep and clean it seemed to come from another century. She had not thought about the chest in years. She knelt and rested her hand on the lid. The cedar was warm from an afternoon of sun through the window. She could feel the grain of it even through the varnish, worn smooth at the edges from decades of hands. She stayed like that for a moment, kneeling, one hand on the lid, the failing light coming through Rosa's curtains in long, amber bars across the floor. Then she stood, went back to the car, and brought in her boxes. She unpacked until the kitchen was functional and the bed was made and the sun had fully dropped behind the mountains. She ate crackers and the last of a cheese she'd brought from Albuquerque, sitting at the big table in the gathering dark, before she remembered to turn on a lamp. Outside, the monsoon cloud had moved off to the east without delivering its rain. Taos was like that, always suggesting things it wasn't quite ready to say. She did not go back to the bedroom until it was time to sleep. When she did, she changed her clothes without looking at the chest, pulled the window open 2 inches to let in the night air, and lay down in the dark. The desert at night in June made almost no sound. No locusts yet. Those came later in summer, filling the sage with their dry percussion. For now, there was only wind through the window screen, the faint settling of old walls, and somewhere out in the dark, a single note from the direction of Taos Mountain that might have been an owl or might have been something the silence made up on its own. Delia lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and listened. She did not sleep for a long time, and when she finally did, she dreamed about the chest. Chapter 2. What the Cedar Held. She woke to the sound of a screen door somewhere down the road and the smell of coffee she hadn't made yet. For a moment, she forgot entirely where she was. The ceiling was wrong, too low, the light coming from the wrong direction, and then the piñon smell found her, and she remembered. Rosa's house, the mountain, the chest at the foot of the bed, which she could feel without looking at it. The way you feel the presence of something large and patient in a room. She made the coffee first. She was a woman who believed that most things in life should wait until coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the morning come into the Taos Valley in stages. First a gray loosening of the dark, then a pale copper line along the Sangre de Cristo range, then, all at once, the way it always happened out here, the full gold arrival of the sun as though it had been waiting off stage and someone had finally cued it. The sage flats lit up from underneath. 2 magpies crossed the sky above the fence and didn't bother to explain themselves. She drank her coffee and thought about her students, specifically about a boy named Oscar who had come to school every day in October wearing this same green sweatshirt and who had cried exactly once in November when the class hamster died, and who had cried so sincerely and so briefly that Delia had thought, that child is going to be all right. She thought about Oscar because thinking about Oscar was easier than thinking about the chest. She rinsed her mug. She walked down the hall. The morning light lay differently in Rosa's bedroom than it had the night before. Cooler, more honest, the light of a place not yet asked to perform. Delia sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the chest for a while. The cedar was a warm red-brown, old enough that the varnish had gone slightly amber, and the brass latch had the green tinge of something that had spent decades in the same position without being asked to move. She reached down and turned the latch. The lid opened on a breath of cedar so clean and dense it was almost a physical thing, like the smell had been stored there intentionally, preserved for exactly this moment, handed over. Beneath the lid, folded with the care of someone who believed that everything worth keeping was worth keeping well. 2 quilts, one in a double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams, one a log cabin pattern in reds and browns that Delia had slept under every visit until she was 11. She lifted them out one by one and set them on the bed. Beneath the quilts, a shoebox. Inside the shoebox, the usual tender accumulations of a long life, a man's watch, a lock of dark hair in a small envelope, a paper-wrapped photograph of Rosa and her husband Ernesto on what appeared to be their wedding day. Impossibly young, impossibly formal, squinting into a sun that had set before Delia was born. She set the shoebox aside, and then, at the very bottom of the chest, in the cedar shadowed corner to the right, a bundle of envelopes tied with kitchen twine. Not many, maybe a dozen. And beside them, folded into thirds like an ordinary piece of paper, a document. And beside the document, a photograph that was not of anyone Delia recognized. She took out the photograph first. A young woman, late 20s, dark hair, a face that was not unbeautiful, but wore the look of someone in the middle of something difficult, sitting in a hospital chair and holding an infant wrapped in a white blanket. The woman was looking directly at the infant. The infant was looking at nothing in particular, the way newborns do, as if they'd come from somewhere so interesting that the current location didn't yet merit their full attention. Delia turned the photograph over. On the back, in Rosa's handwriting, Sylvia, March 4th, and a year. The year Delia was born. She set the photograph down on the quilt beside her. She picked up the folded document with hands that had gone very still and very careful, the way her hands got when she was trying not to telegraph anything to the 23 small people watching her for cues. She unfolded it. It was a birth certificate. Her name was on it. Her birthday, March 4th, was on it, and in the space for mother, a name she did not recognize. Sylvia Montoya, not Rosa, not her mother Carmen, who had died when Delia was 4, and who existed in Delia's memory only as warmth and a particular shade of yellow dress. Not any name she knew. Sylvia Montoya. She sat with it. The morning light moved across the floor. The refrigerator hummed its note. A car passed on the road outside, someone going somewhere with no idea that in this room, a woman was sitting at the edge of an ordinary bed, holding an ordinary piece of paper that had just rearranged everything. Delia set the document down carefully on top of the photograph. She looked at the bundle of letters for a long moment. Then she closed the lid of the cedar chest, stood up, and went outside. She sat on the porch steps for a very long time. The morning became noon. The noon became afternoon. The monsoon clouds that had failed to arrive the night before were building again over the mountain, taller today, more serious in their intentions. The hollyhocks along the fence swayed in a wind she couldn't feel from where she was sitting. She thought, in fragments, about a verse she'd memorized as a child. Something from the Psalms about being woven together in a secret place, about being known before she was formed, about days written down before a single one of them had arrived. She had always taken it as comfort. She was not sure right now what she took it as. The afternoon light changed. She went back inside. She picked up one letter from the bundle, not untying the twine, just sliding the topmost envelope free, and sat down in Rosa's good chair by the window and held it in her lap for a moment. Then she worked the flap open. She began to read. Chapter 3. The Handwriting of Someone Who Loved Her. The letters were not what she expected. She had braced herself, she realized, for guilt, for apology, for the cramped, careful language of people covering their tracks. What she found instead was Rosa. Fully, recognizably Rosa, the same woman who had pressed Delia's face between her palms every goodbye and said, "Mija, you are the best thing," writing to strangers and family alike with a directness that had no interest in self-protection. There were 11 letters in the bundle. 3 were addressed to someone named Sylvia Montoya at an address in Ranchos de Taos. 2 were addressed to Tomás, Delia's father, and bore dates from the year before Delia was born. 4 were letters from people she didn't know, responses to letters Rosa must have sent, and Delia set those aside. One was from a lawyer whose letterhead she didn't recognize, brief and formal, referencing an arrangement made with the consent of all parties. And one was addressed, in Rosa's handwriting, to Delia. She read that one last. She started with the letters to Sylvia. Rosa's hand was looping and unhurried, the cursive of a woman who had learned it in a schoolroom where it was still taught as a matter of character. She wrote to Sylvia the way she might write to a daughter-in-law, with warmth that had clearly been earned through something difficult. The first letter, dated about 8 months before Delia's birth, opened without preamble. Sylvia, I want you to know that we have prayed over this child already. Ernesto and I both. Whatever you decide, this baby is already loved. Delia read it twice. The letters to Sylvia were few and careful, mapping the outlines of an arrangement made between women who had chosen to trust each other when trust was not required. Sylvia had been 29. She had been unmarried. Rosa's letters never named the circumstances beyond that, but there was a gentleness in them that suggested Rosa understood more than she recorded. In the last letter to Sylvia, written the week after Delia was born, she is here. She is perfect. Tomás held her and did not stop smiling for 2 days. I think God knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote this particular story, even the parts that hurt. Delia set that letter on the table and pressed her hand flat on top of it. She read the letters to Tomás. They were older and less guarded, Rosa writing to her son the way mothers write when they believe they are the only adult in the room. She was clearly the one who had found Sylvia, who had navigated the legal arrangement, who had organized the whole quiet architecture of what would become Delia's life. There was a line in the second letter that made Delia's throat close. Tomás, I know you are frightened, but I have prayed, and I believe Galatians 4 with everything in me. This child will be fully yours, fully family, fully an heir to everything you have and everything you are. Not a half measure, not second best. The real thing. She had underlined the real thing twice, the kind of underlining that meant she expected him to push back. Delia sat with those letters until the light in the room had shifted. Then she picked up the last one. Delia, just her name, on the front of the envelope, with no stamp, never sent, written in the hand that had also written all her birthday cards and the notes tucked into lunches and the inscription in the children's Bible she'd had since she was 4 years old. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said, I wanted to tell you myself, and I was never brave enough, and I am sorry for that. You deserve to hear it from my voice. The second paragraph said, you were prayed for before we had you. You were named by your father the night we first held you. You were chosen. And I want you to hear that word the way God means it, not the way fear means it. Chosen is not a word for children who were unwanted. It is a word for children who were so wanted that someone moved heaven and earth to make sure they arrived where they were supposed to be. The third paragraph said, you are mine, Misha. You are Tomás's. You are God's. That is a lot of belonging for one person, and I hope it is enough. I think it will be enough. I have always thought you were the kind of person who could carry more than she thinks. Delia folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. She picked up her phone. Tomás answered on the second ring, the way he always did, and said Mija before she could say anything, which meant he had been waiting for this call. He confirmed it in the way her father did most hard things, plainly, without ornament, sitting with the weight of it, rather than trying to lift it away from her. He said he was sorry she had found out this way. He said Rosa had meant to tell her, that they had talked about it more than once, that Rosa had written that letter years ago. He said he did not know why they kept waiting, except that there was never a right time, and eventually there was no time left. Then he said quietly, I have never once, not for one single day, thought of you as anything but my daughter." His voice broke on the last word in a way she had never heard her father's voice break before, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully until she trusted herself to speak. They stayed on the phone for a long time without saying very much. It was enough. She had been sitting in the dark for 20 minutes before she realized she hadn't turned on a lamp when the outside light failed, and she was reaching for the switch when her phone buzzed. Becca Torres. "Of course." "I'm calling because I had a feeling," Becca said before Delia could speak, which I know sounds like something a strange woman would say, but here we are. Delia laughed. A real one, short and surprised, and then told her everything in a torrent that lasted 45 minutes and covered every letter and both phone calls and the photograph of the woman at the hospital and the way the cedar chest had smelled when she opened it and the fact that she had eaten almost nothing since the crackers last night. Becca listened to all of it. She was good at that. The listening first, before any of the rest. When Delia finally ran out of words, Becca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't decide anything tonight." "I'm not trying to decide anything." "I know you," Becca said, with the precision of someone who had known her since the 6th grade. "You're already running the calculations. What does this mean? What do I do? Who am I now? Stop running them. Tonight, you just found out. That's all tonight has to be." Delia leaned her head back against Rosa's good chair. "There's a woman," she said, "named Sylvia Montoya. She lives 30 minutes away." The silence that came back was the silence of Becca, choosing her words. "I know," Delia said. "I know." "I'm coming up this weekend," Becca said. "Don't you dare clean the house before I get there." After they hung up, Delia sat in Rosa's chair in Rosa's lamplit kitchen for a long time. The letters were spread across the table in front of her. The photograph of Sylvia at the hospital sat at the far corner, face up. The mountain outside was invisible in the dark, but she knew exactly where it was. She reached over and turned the photograph face down. Not against it, just not ready. She left the letters where they were and went to bed. Chapter 4. First Sunday. Becca Torres arrived Saturday afternoon in a cloud of road dust and strong opinions, carrying a bag of tamales from the place on 4th Street that Delia's father had declared the best in Albuquerque, which was not a title anyone in Albuquerque awarded lightly. She hugged Delia for a long time without saying anything, which was how Delia knew she understood the severity of the situation, because Becca's natural state was talking. Then she read every letter. She sat at Rosa's kitchen table and read them all the way through. Twice, in the silence of someone who was loading up to say something worth saying. When she finished, she stacked them carefully, folded her hands on top of the pile, and looked at Delia. "Okay," she said. "First of all, Rosa was extraordinary." "I know. Second of all, there is a woman who may be 30 minutes from this house." "I know." "Third of all," Becca said, "you need to eat something." Delia sat down across from her. "That's only 3 things. Usually you have 5. "I'm pacing myself," Becca said. "It's early in the visit." They stayed up until midnight, which was not difficult because it was Becca, and being with Becca was like standing near a fire, warm and energizing and occasionally too much, and you were always glad you stayed. They talked about the letters and Tomás and Sylvia, and the way the cedar chest had smelled when Delia opened it, and then, at some point, the conversation loosened into the lighter talk of old friends who had covered the necessary ground and could now simply be together, and that was its own kind of sustaining. Becca was still asleep when Delia left for church in the morning. She left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Coffee is made," and then felt guilty for how relieved she was to have an hour to herself before Becca's particular brand of love filled up all the quiet spaces in the room. She needed to walk into that building alone. She wasn't sure she could explain why, except that it felt like something she owed to Rosa, or to herself, or to the part of her that was still trying to understand what it meant to return somewhere after you had been changed. She had been coming to this church since she was 4 years old. That was the thing about it. The thing that made the drive over sit differently than it had last week when everything was still ordinary. She knew the low adobe wall and the bougainvillea that had been staging its conquest of the corner for as long as she could remember. She knew the way the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose behind the roofline and made the building look small in exactly the right way. She knew the wooden cross above the entrance and the parking lot that was dirt because it had always been dirt, and there had never been sufficient consensus to change it. What she didn't know, pulling open the door, was how it would feel to walk in carrying this. The answer, it turned out, was that it felt like walking into her grandmother's kitchen and finding someone had moved the table. Everything was right except for the fact that nothing was where she'd left it inside herself. The pews were the same mismatched wood. She had forgotten about that, the way they'd been acquired one by one over the decades until the room looked like the furniture had simply wandered in and decided to stay. The older women in the second pew were the same older women in the second pew, or their successors, or perhaps exactly the same women because some forces of nature simply continue. A woman named Frances, who had taught Delia's Sunday school class the summer she was 9 and had smelled magnificently of rosewater and breath mints, caught her eye from across the room and pointed at her and mouthed "Rosa's girl" with an expression of such uncomplicated delight that Delia had to look at the floor for a moment. A woman appeared at her elbow, holding a bulletin and a small cup of coffee. "I don't think we've met," she said warmly. "I'm Elena Reyes. My husband is the pastor." She had a face that had made peace with itself at some point and was better looking for it. "You look like you might be Rosa Vargas's granddaughter?" "Delia," she said, accepting the coffee. "He must be newer. I don't remember a Pastor Reyes." 6 years in June, Elena said. "We came from Albuquerque." She pressed Delia's hand once, not the pump and release of a formal introduction, but the brief full press of someone who meant it, and said, "We loved your grandmother," and moved on to greet someone else with the same ease. And Delia thought, this is a woman who has been welcoming people her whole life and has never once made it feel like a job. Pastor Damon was younger than she expected from a pastor, mid-40s, with the unhurried movement of someone who had made a deliberate practice of not rushing. He preached without notes, which either meant he was extraordinarily prepared or extraordinarily comfortable, and in Delia's experience, it was always both. His text was from the first chapter of Jeremiah, the word of the Lord telling the prophet that before he formed him in the womb, he knew him. That before Jeremiah was born, God had set him apart, called him, written him into a story larger than anything Jeremiah had imagined for himself. Delia went very still. She was sitting in a pew she had sat in as a child, in a building that smelled like candle wax and old wood and the specific Sunday morning smell of a congregation that had been gathering in the same place for a very long time, 3 days after finding a birth certificate at the bottom of a cedar chest, and a man she had never heard preach before was reading the words, "Before you were born, I set you apart," as though they were not extraordinary, as though this were simply what was true. She didn't cry. She breathed carefully and let the words go wherever they were going to go. After the service, the congregation moved into the courtyard with the ease of people who had nowhere more urgent to be. The morning had turned genuinely warm, the way Taos mornings did, once the overnight cool burned off, and someone had set up a folding table with coffee and biscochitos that were already half gone. The mountains presided over the adobe wall the way they always had, close enough to feel like company. She was standing near a low wall, reading the spines of a row of books someone had laid out in the sun, when she heard footsteps coming fast around the corner, and then a rather colorful word. Quickly reconsidered and replaced with something more suitable for a church courtyard. As a man came around the corner carrying a tower of cardboard boxes he clearly could not see over, caught the toe of his boot on the courtyard step, and lurched to a magnificent stop approximately 6 inches from where she was standing. The boxes did not fall. He held on to them through what appeared to be sheer force of will. They both stood there for a moment. "Hi," he said from behind the boxes. "Hi," Delia said. He lowered the stack far enough to see over it, 30-ish, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from actual outdoor hours rather than intention. There was a trace of reddish clay on his left forearm that he had either not noticed or not considered worth addressing. His expression was the expression of a man who had just nearly taken out a stranger with a stack of cardboard and found the situation basically reasonable. "These are for the youth room," he said. "Which is that way?" He tilted his head toward a door across the courtyard. "You were going the right direction," Delia offered. "I was," he agreed. "I just couldn't see the step. There's only the one." "In retrospect," he said, "that's not very many." She laughed, the kind that arrived before she decided whether she was in the mood for it, which was, she would think later, how the best ones always came. He repositioned the boxes, got a better grip, and looked at her with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Marcus Treadwell. I lead the youth group, thus the boxes." "Delia Vargas. I'm settling my grandmother's estate." She glanced at the coffee cup in her hand. "Thus the coffee." "Rosa Vargas," he said, and something in his face did a softening that a name can produce in someone who meant it. "She brought tamales to the potluck every Christmas. I'm still not over it." She would be glad to hear that. He smiled, a straightforward smile, undecorated, said he hoped she'd come back, and continued across the courtyard with the careful balance of a man who had learned a lesson and intended to keep it. Pastor Damon materialized at her shoulder with the quiet timing of a man accustomed to showing up at the right moment. "Marcus is one of the best people I know," he said. "Also, he has been coming to church with clay on his arm since he was 17, so if you were considering mentioning it, he's aware." "I wasn't going to mention it," Delia said. "No," the pastor said. "I didn't think so." She drove home with the windows down and the sage-warmed air moving through the car. She was not thinking about Marcus Treadwell, except in the way you think about something you are specifically choosing not to think about. She was thinking about the sermon. About being known before you are formed. About a name on a birth certificate and a woman 30 minutes south on a road she had driven 100 times. She pulled into the driveway to find Becca sitting on the porch steps in yesterday's clothes, holding a coffee mug with both hands, squinting at the mountain with the expression of someone who had just woken up and was still negotiating with the sun. "How was it?" Becca asked. "Good," Delia said. "Really good." Becca studied her over the rim of the mug. "And?" Delia pressed her lips together. "He knows. He had clay on his arm." Becca's smile was slow and complete and entirely too satisfied for this hour of the morning. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Chapter 5. Ranchos de Taos is 30 minutes away. She found Sylvia Montoya on a Tuesday. It did not take long. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had imagined the search as something that would require effort, that would give her time to prepare, that would build slowly enough for her to find her footing before she arrived at any kind of answer. Instead, she sat down at Rosa's kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of coffee on a quiet Tuesday morning and typed a name into a search window. And in less than 4 minutes, she had a faculty page. Sylvia Montoya, middle school music teacher, Ranchos de Taos. The photograph on the faculty page was small and slightly overexposed in the way of photographs taken in school hallways with insufficient lighting. But it was enough. Delia recognized the shape of the face from the hospital photograph. The same strong jaw, the same dark eyes, though the hair was shorter now and threaded through with gray. She was smiling in the faculty photo with the smile of someone who had been asked to smile for a camera and had done their best. She looked like a person who had a favorite coffee mug and strong feelings about the school's budget for instruments and stayed late on Thursdays. She looked ordinary and specific and real in a way that the name on a birth certificate had not quite been. Delia closed the laptop. She went outside and pulled 3 weeks of weeds from Rosa's hollyhock bed, which took 45 minutes and left her hands dirty, and her mind no quieter than it had been. She opened the laptop again and looked up the school. Ranchos de Taos sat about 4 miles south of Taos proper, settled into the high desert landscape with the unhurried permanence of a place that had been exactly where it was for a very long time and had no plans to relocate. The drive down State Road 68 took you past red-brown mesa and scrub juniper and the occasional cluster of buildings that appeared without much preamble and disappeared the same way. And then, before you reached the village center, you came around a long curve in the road and the San Francisco de Asís church appeared. Delia had seen it her whole life, and it still did what it always did. The church was one of the most painted and photographed buildings in New Mexico, which was saying something in a state that had always attracted artists the way the desert attracted hawks. Because of the light, because of the space, because of something in the quality of the air that made visible things look more themselves than anywhere else. Georgia O'Keeffe had painted the church more than once, drawn to its massive earthen buttresses, its thick adobe walls that seemed to grow from the ground rather than sit upon it, its refusal to be anything other than exactly what it was. In the afternoon, the light came across those walls in a way that made the color shift from pale sand to deep ochre to something almost amber, and the shadows moved like living things, and it was the kind of beauty that asked something of you rather than simply offering itself. Delia drove past it without stopping and continued south to the middle school. She did not have a plan. That was the honest accounting of the situation. She had gotten in the car without a plan, which was unlike her, and she was aware of that, and she drove anyway. She told herself she was just looking at the building. She told herself she was not ready to do anything yet, that this was reconnaissance, that there was nothing wrong with driving past a school. She pulled into the parking lot across the street at 2:45 and turned off the engine. At 3:10, the school day ended. Students came out in the uneven surge of middle schoolers everywhere, some in loud clusters, some with their heads down, some moving with the provisional dignity of 13-year-olds who had recently decided they were older than they were. A few teachers appeared in the doorway. A woman with a tote bag full of folders turned left toward the parking lot and walked to a blue sedan and put the folders in the trunk with the efficiency of someone who had done this at the end of every school day for a long time and had the motion memorized. She was too far away. Delia could not see her face clearly. She could see dark hair gone mostly gray, a green cardigan despite the warmth of the afternoon, unhurried steps. She put her hand on the ignition key. She did not turn it. She sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes while the afternoon sorted itself out around her. More cars leaving, the cluster of students thinning, the school settling into the quiet of a building that had finished its main purpose for the day. The blue sedan did not move. Sylvia Montoya, if it was her, and Delia believed it was her, was apparently still inside. She turned the key. She drove home the long way, back past the church, and this time she slowed without quite stopping, watching the afternoon light do what it did to those walls. The building stood the way it had stood for over 200 years, through drought and flood, and the long, slow changes that came to every place that stayed in one location long enough to see history move through it. Something about its permanence felt relevant to her situation in a way she couldn't yet articulate. As if the fact of a thing surviving that long was itself a kind of argument. She drove home. That evening she called Tomás. He was in a better place than the last time they'd spoken, or perhaps simply more prepared, had spent the days since their first conversation finding his footing. He asked how she was. She told him she'd found Sylvia. She heard him exhale slowly on his end of the line. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I drove past the school." He was quiet for a moment. "She never tried to make contact," he said. "In 29 years. I want you to know that, not because it changes anything, but because I think you should know." Delia turned that over. She wasn't sure yet whether it made things simpler or more complicated. "I'm not angry," she said, testing the sentence to see if it was true. It was mostly true. There was something in the vicinity of anger. A heat without a clear target, a feeling that wanted somewhere to go and hadn't found it yet. But the center of what she felt was something more disorienting than anger. It was the feeling of standing in a room she thought she knew and finding a door she had never noticed. After she hung up, she sat with her journal open and did not write for a long time. Then she wrote a single line from a passage she'd been turning over since her second morning in the house. Something from Genesis, the story of Hagar in the wilderness, a woman alone in a desert, with nothing but a promise she wasn't sure she trusted. The Bible tells the story of Hagar looking up and recognizing that God had seen her in that desert place, had found her there, and she named him the God who sees me. Delia had always read that story at a slight distance, as something that had happened to someone else in another time. She wrote the name in her journal now as though it belonged to her. Elroy, the God who sees me. She underlined it once. She closed the journal. She looked out the window at the dark where the mountain was. She was not ready. She knew she was not ready. But there was something she also knew, sitting in Rosa's good chair in the lamplight with the cedar chest in the next room and a name on a faculty page 30 minutes south. She was closer to ready than she had been yesterday. And maybe that was how it worked. Maybe you didn't arrive at ready all at once. Maybe you drove past the school and went home and wrote a name in your journal and went to sleep, and in the morning you were a fraction closer, and you kept going until the fraction became enough. Her phone buzzed. A text from Becca. "Thinking about you today. Also thinking that the next time you drive somewhere and just sit in the parking lot, you could call me and I'll sit in it with you from Albuquerque." Delia stared at it. "How did you know I sat in a parking lot?" she typed back. 3 dots appeared. Then, "Because I know you." She set the phone down, and for the first time in several days, the feeling in her chest was something she could almost call peace. Not resolution, not answers, just the quiet of being known by someone who was paying attention. She went to bed. Outside, the desert held its June silence, and the mountain stood where it always stood. And 30 minutes south, on a road she had driven 100 times, a blue sedan sat in a school parking lot, while a woman inside stayed late. Chapter 6. The Potter's Hands. She ran into him at the farmer's market on a Thursday morning. She had gone for tomatoes and come away with tomatoes, a jar of local honey, a small bunch of dried lavender she didn't strictly need, and a conversation with an elderly man named Gilbert who had grown green chile on the same plot of land outside Taos for 41 years and had opinions about rainfall that she found unexpectedly compelling. The Taos Farmers Market occupied the plaza parking lot on Thursday mornings through the summer, and the plaza itself, with its old cottonwood trees and its portal of shops and the ancient feel of a space that had been a gathering place since long before anyone currently using it was born, made even the simple act of buying tomatoes feel like something worth doing slowly. She was weighing the lavender in her hand, deciding when she heard her name. Marcus was 2 stalls down, holding a paper bag and talking to the honey vendor with the ease of someone who knew everyone at this market and had for years. He spotted her, said something to the vendor, and made his way over with the same steady quality she'd noticed at the church, as though he had allocated sufficient time for whatever was about to happen and was not concerned about the rest of the morning. "Lavender?" he said by way of greeting. "I'm deciding," she said. "It's good lavender. Gilbert over there grows it." He nodded toward the dried herb table. "He also grows green chile and has a lot to say about rainfall." "I know," Delia said. "I've met Gilbert." Marcus smiled. "Then you've already had the full Taos experience. Everything else is optional." She bought the lavender. They walked out of the market together in the natural way of 2 people who were both finished and both heading in the same direction, and when they stopped at the edge of the plaza where the paths diverged, he asked if she'd like to see the pottery studio. He said it without pressure or orchestration, the way he seemed to say most things, as though the idea had simply occurred to him and he was passing it along for her consideration. "The youth group does a session there on Friday afternoons," he said. "But Thursdays are quiet. Good light." "I don't know anything about pottery," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "You can just watch." The studio was on the northern edge of town, down a dirt road lined with chamisa that would turn gold come fall, in a low adobe building with wide windows and a rusted metal roof, and a hand-painted sign by the door that said Treadwell Pottery in letters that had weathered to a comfortable modesty. Inside, the light was everything he had promised, warm and wide and unpretentious, falling across the work tables and the shelf of drying pieces, and the big wheel in the center of the room with the generosity of New Mexico light, which seemed to understand that its job was to illuminate, rather than to impress. The smell of the place settled over her immediately. Wet earth and mineral coolness, and something faintly wooden from the shelves. The smell of material in the middle of becoming something, not finished and not raw, but held in the suspension of a thing being worked on with patience. Marcus tied on an apron, centered a mound of clay on the wheel, and sat down without ceremony. She pulled a stool to a comfortable distance and watched. He was good. Not good in the way of someone who practiced something. Good in the way of someone who had found the thing their hands were made for and had spent years confirming it. The clay responded to him the way water responds to a shore current, rising and opening and taking shape with a fluid logic that looked inevitable even though she understood it wasn't, that every inch of what was happening was the result of decision and pressure and a calibrated stillness she found unexpectedly moving to watch. They talked while he worked. She asked how he'd come to pottery, and he said his mother Iris had signed him up for a class at 15 because he was restless in the way teenage boys are restless, and she believed correctly that his hands needed something to do. He'd never stopped. She asked about the youth group, and he talked about those kids with a warmth that was completely unperformative. Specific kids, specific moments. A girl named Amara, who had come in hostile and left, 3 months later, able to name one person in the world who cared whether she showed up. He said that was the whole job, most of the time. Getting kids to the place where they could name that person. And then, somewhere in the second hour, in the easy way of a conversation that had moved past the formal layers and found its own level, he mentioned that he was adopted. He said it the way you say the weather was clear or the drive was easy, as a fact woven into the fabric of the story, not the whole cloth of it. Iris Treadwell had raised him alone from the time he was 4 months old. He didn't know much about the circumstances before that, and he had reached a point in his life, some years back, where he understood that not knowing was not the same as not belonging. He said Iris had always talked about him being chosen in the same breath as she talked about Scripture. There was a passage in Ephesians that she had practically written into the walls of their house, something about how God had chosen us before the world began and adopted us as His own children through Christ, not as a consolation or a contingency, but as the very plan. She'd read it to him enough times that it had stopped being a verse and become simply a fact about the nature of things. He shaped the rim of the bowl with his thumbs. Delia sat on her stool and said nothing for a moment. She had expected, without quite knowing she'd expected it, for adoption to look like a wound in him, something carried carefully, something that required acknowledgement and management. Instead, it sat in him like the pottery sat on his shelf, made, complete, and fully itself. He was not a man processing something. He was a man who had processed something and come out the other side knowing who he was. That was, she thought, either the most comforting thing she had encountered in the past 2 weeks or the most disorienting. She hadn't decided which. "Did you ever want to find them?" she asked. "Your biological parents?" He considered it without deflecting. "For a while, when I was about 20, 21. He paused, hands still moving. "But I realized I was looking for something I already had. I wanted to know where I came from so I could understand who I was. And then, one morning, I understood that I already knew who I was. Iris had made sure of that." He glanced up briefly. "It didn't mean the question wasn't real. It just meant the answer wasn't where I was looking." She nodded. She did not tell him anything. Not yet. It was not the right moment, and she was not ready, and he did not ask, which she appreciated more than she could have said. They talked for another hour, about Taos and Albuquerque and teaching kindergartners and the challenge of getting middle schoolers to sit still long enough to feel anything, which it turned out was his central professional problem and hers in adjacent form. The conversation moved the way good conversations move, not in a straight line, but in widening circles, each loop covering more ground than the last. At some point, the light in the studio shifted into the long gold of late afternoon. He finished the bowl, set it on the drying shelf, and washed his hands at the deep utility sink in the corner. Then he went to a low shelf near the window, where a tray of small, irregular clay crosses sat in a row. Handmade, clearly, each one slightly different from the last, none of them quite uniform. "The youth kids made these last week," he said. "We talked about how nothing we make is perfect, and that's not the point." He picked one up and held it for a moment. "You should have one." He crossed the room and held it out. She took it. The clay was still faintly warm from the shelf, or from his hand, and it was rough at the edges in the way of something made by a young person still learning what their hands could do. It was small enough to close her fingers around completely. She didn't say anything. He didn't seem to require her to. She drove home in the long June evening with the window down and the warm air moving through the car and the little clay cross in her right hand. Her fingers loosely closed around it the whole drive, feeling the rough edges and the weight of it, which was slight and substantial at the same time, in the way that small true things sometimes are. She set it on Rosa's windowsill when she got inside. She stood looking at it for a moment, crooked, handmade, a little rough, entirely itself. Then she went to make dinner and tried, with limited success, to think about something else. Chapter 7. Becca comes back to Taos. Becca arrived on a Friday evening in late June with a bag of tamales from the same place on 4th Street and the expression of a woman who had been composing sentences in her head for 200 miles and was ready to say them. "Before you ask," she said, handing Delia the bag. "Yes, I brought tamales again. I will always bring tamales. That is not up for discussion." "I wasn't going to ask," Delia said. "Good." Becca stepped inside, dropped her overnight bag by the door, and looked at Delia with the frank, measuring look of someone who had known her since the 6th grade and had learned to read the difference between fine and fine. "You look like you've been sleeping," she said. "Which is good. You also look like you've been thinking too much, which cancels it out." They ate at Rosa's big table with the windows open and the evening air moving through the curtains, carrying the smell of sage and the end-of-day coolness that the high desert produced like clockwork, as though it understood the day had been warm enough and was correcting the situation. Delia told Becca everything that had happened since the first visit. Gilbert and the lavender, the faculty page, the parking lot, the pottery studio, the clay cross on the windowsill, the conversation with Tomás, the way Sylvia's blue sedan had not moved while she sat across the street with her hand on the ignition key. Becca listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not her natural mode and meant she was taking it seriously. When Delia finished, Becca was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tamale in her hand. Then she looked up. "Can I say something honest?" "That has never once stopped you," Delia said. "You are treating this like a math problem," Becca said, "like there is a correct sequence of steps, and if you execute them in the right order, you will arrive at the right answer and everything will resolve. Find Sylvia, process the letters, understand where you came from, then know who you are." She set the tamale down. "That is not how identity works, Dee. You don't solve it, you receive it." Delia opened her mouth and closed it again. "You've been asking who you are since you opened that chest," Becca said, as if the answer is in the chest. It's not in the chest. The chest had information. Information is not identity. The evening light was doing something lovely to the kitchen walls, the warm adobe color going deeper as the sun dropped, the room settling into itself. Delia looked at the windowsill where the clay cross sat, slightly crooked, entirely itself. "I know that," she said. "You know it the way you know things before you believe them," Becca said, which was precise enough that Delia didn't argue. They cleared the table and took their coffee outside to the backyard, where Rosa had strung a line of old solar lights between the fence posts that still worked, coming on at dusk with the faint, warm glow of something that had been doing its small job faithfully for years. The sky above Taos at night was the kind of sky that people who had grown up under city light did not entirely believe until they saw it, dense with stars, the Milky Way a visible brushstroke across the dark from one horizon to the other. They sat in Rosa's old lawn chairs and were quiet for a while in the comfortable way of people who had long ago stopped needing to fill the silence between them. "Tell me about Marcus," Becca said. "I told you about Marcus." "You told me he had clay on his arm and makes pottery and leads the youth group." She sipped her coffee. "That is a description. I want to know about Marcus." Delia looked at the stars. She told her about the studio, about watching him work, about the way he talked about those youth kids with specificity rather than sentiment. She told her what he'd said about his adoption, the way he held it, the way Iris had built his identity on something more permanent than origin. She told her about the Ephesians passage and the clay cross, and driving home with it in her closed hand the whole way. When she finished, Becca said, "He sounds like someone who has done the work." "He has," Delia said. "That's the thing. He's on the other side of it, and I'm standing here at the beginning, and I don't even know if I—" She stopped. "If you what?" "If I know how to let someone see me when I don't know what they're looking at." The solar lights glowed along the fence. Something moved in the chamisa beyond the yard. A mouse or a nightbird, something small going about its necessary business. Becca set her mug on the arm of her chair. "Can I say the other honest thing?" "There's more? You've been holding God at arm's length for 2 years," Becca said. "Since the engagement ended. You go to church and you do all the things, but there's a part of you that's been managed. Like you built a glass wall between yourself and actually letting any of it be real." She paused. "I think that cedar chest was God's way of walking through the glass." Delia was quiet for a long time. The stars were very bright. The mountain was invisible in the dark, but she knew exactly where it was, the way she always knew. "I don't know how to pray anymore," she said finally. "I mean, I say prayers, but I don't know if I'm saying them to anyone or just rehearsing." "I know," Becca said. "I've been watching you rehearse for 2 years." She said it without cruelty, which was the only way Becca could have said it and had it land right. "The Bible talks about adoption more than once," Becca said after a while. "Romans 8. There's something in there about how God doesn't give us a spirit that makes us afraid. He gives us the spirit of adoption, the thing that lets us actually call him Father, not at a distance, not managed." She glanced over. "You've known that verse since you were 12, but maybe you need to know it differently now, from the inside of it instead of the outside." Delia turned that over. The spirit of adoption, not fear, not the careful arrangement of correct belief from behind a glass wall, the actual cry of an actual child to an actual father who was actually there. "Will you pray with me?" she said. It came out smaller than she intended, which was probably right. Becca reached over and took her hand, just like that. "I thought you'd never ask." They prayed the way people pray when they have set down all the formal language and just said the thing, halting and honest and occasionally circling back because neither of them found the words on the first try. Delia's part was mostly sitting in the dark, with her eyes closed, listening to Becca say what she hadn't been able to say herself, and finding that was enough. That was, perhaps, exactly the right amount. You did not have to have the words. You only had to show up. When Becca finished, they sat for a while longer. The lights along the fence glowed their patient, faithful glow. "I'm going to go see her," Delia said eventually. "Sylvia." "I know," Becca said. "I don't know what I'm going to say." "You don't have to know yet." "You're very comfortable with not knowing things," Delia said. "I don't know how you do that." "Years of practice," Becca said. "Also, I'm not the one who has to do it. That helps." Delia laughed, a real one, warm and tired, and leaned her head back and looked up at the sky that went on forever above this small yard in Taos, New Mexico, where her grandmother had strung lights along the fence and prayed over a child she had chosen and never quite found the words to tell. The mountain stood where it always stood. She was getting closer. Chapter 8. What she told Marcus. He had mentioned the trail the week before in the offhand way he mentioned most things, as an idea offered without agenda, no pressure attached. The Rio Grande Gorge Trail, he said, was best in the morning before the heat settled in. He went most Saturdays. She was welcome to come if she wanted something to do with her feet, while her head worked through whatever her head was working through. She had said she'd think about it. She texted him at 7:15 on Saturday morning and said she was in. He picked her up at 8 in a truck that had clearly been used for the transportation of clay and lumber, and probably river rocks, and had no apologies to make about any of it. He handed her a thermos of coffee without being asked, which she accepted as evidence of good character, and they drove west out of town on US 64, while the morning was still cool, and the sage flats on either side of the road held the long shadows of early light. The Rio Grande Gorge Bridge appeared without much warning, the way it always did. You were driving across flat, high desert, and then suddenly, you were 800 feet above a river that had been cutting through volcanic rock for somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000,000 years, and had the kind of patience that made human urgency look quaint. The bridge was long and spare and industrial, not beautiful in any decorative sense, but beautiful in the way of things that do exactly what they were made to do without pretending to be anything else. Below it, the Rio Grande moved green and purposeful through a canyon that the morning light had not yet fully reached. They parked and found the trail. It ran along the western rim of the gorge, dropping gradually toward the river, through a landscape of basalt and bunchgrass, and the occasional determined wildflower that had found a foothold in the volcanic rock and was making the most of it. The air at this elevation had the quality Delia had always loved about the high desert, thin and clean and honest, as though it had been processed down to its essential components and nothing superfluous remained. Below them, the river appeared and disappeared between the canyon walls as the trail wound south. They walked for a while without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. Marcus was a comfortable person to be quiet with. She had noticed that in the studio. He didn't fill silence out of discomfort, didn't perform ease. He was easy, and the quiet around him took on the same quality. "Can I tell you something?" she said about a mile in. "Yes," he said without hesitation or qualification. So she told him. She told it the way she had not quite managed to tell it to anyone yet. Not in the torrent she had poured out to Becca on the phone, not in the fragmented, careful conversation with her father. She told it as a whole thing, from the beginning, the way a story needs to be told when you are ready to actually tell it. The cedar chest and the smell of it. The photograph of the young woman at the hospital. Her name on the birth certificate above a name she didn't recognize. Rosa's letters, the one to Sylvia, the ones to Tomás, the unsent one addressed to Delia. The phone call with her father, the way his voice had broken on the word daughter. The faculty page. The parking lot in Ranchos de Taos, the blue sedan, her hand on the ignition key. Marcus listened the way she had watched him work at the wheel, with his full attention, without interruption, without the small performances of sympathy that some people offered in place of actual presence. He asked 2 questions, both at natural pauses, both the right questions. What did Rosa's letter say exactly? And later, what did it feel like to see her? That second question stopped her mid-step. "I didn't get close enough to see her," she said. "Not really." "I know," he said. "That's why I asked what it felt like." She thought about it honestly. "Like standing at the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of," she said, "and not knowing if jumping was brave or foolish." He nodded, as though that was a reasonable and accurate description of the situation, which she found obscurely comforting. The trail dipped toward the river at a rocky section, the basalt breaking into uneven shelves and loose aggregate where the path narrowed to single file. He went first and turned at the bottom, offering his hand to steady her on the last steep step down. She took it. She was steady enough on her own. He probably knew that. She took it anyway, and when she reached the flat ground below the rock shelf, he didn't quite let go, and she didn't quite pull away, and they walked the next quarter-mile along the river, with their hands loosely linked, and neither of them said anything about it, which felt like exactly the right thing. The Rio Grande moved beside them, green and cold and ancient, indifferent to the two people walking its edge and doing what people had probably always done beside rivers, which was try to figure out who they were. "I know that feeling," he said after a while. "The edge of something with no visible bottom." She glanced at him. "When I was 20, I drove to the town in Colorado where the agency said I was born," he said. "I didn't have a name or an address. I just drove there and walked around for about 2 hours and then drove home." He paused. "I couldn't have told you what I was looking for. I think I was looking for the feeling that I'd done something. Moved toward it. Even if moving toward it meant standing in a parking lot in a town I'd never been to and going home without anything I didn't already have." "Did it help?" she asked. He considered it. "It helped me understand that what I needed wasn't there, which sounds like a failure, but it wasn't. It was clarifying." He looked at the river. Iris used to say that the questions that matter most don't get answered by facts. They get answered by love. She meant God, but she also just meant the people who show up. Delia was quiet for a moment. "I'm afraid," she said, which was the most direct she had been with him and possibly with anyone. "Not of Sylvia exactly. More of what it means about me. If she's the answer to where I came from, then I have to figure out what that changes. And I'm afraid it changes something I can't put back." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood on the river trail, with the canyon walls rising on the far side of the water and the morning light finally reaching the bottom of the gorge, touching the surface of the Rio Grande and turning it from green to a glancing, broken gold. "Can I say something that might be annoying?" he said. "Based on what I know of you," she said, "you're going to say it considerately enough that I won't be able to be annoyed." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "What if it doesn't change who you are?" he said. "What if it just adds to it the way a river adds to the landscape? It's not the same landscape it was before the river, but the river doesn't erase what was already there. It just cuts deeper." She looked at the Rio Grande. 800 feet below the high desert, a million years of patient work. A canyon that would not exist without the water and would not be what it was without the rock. "That's not annoying," she said after a moment. "I got lucky," he said. They turned back after another half-mile, the sun fully up now and the heat beginning its work on the canyon. The trail back was easier, uphill but familiar, the landmarks already known. He told her about Iris on the way up, more than he had in the studio. Specifics. The texture of being raised by her, how she made French toast every Sunday morning and sang off-key to the radio and had a way of sitting in the front pew at church that communicated without any words at all, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and God could have her full attention. How she had taped an index card to the bathroom mirror when he was 13 that said, "You are chosen. Act like it." He had been mildly embarrassed by it as a teenager and had kept the card ever since. Delia laughed at that. "She sounds like Rosa," she said. The way Rosa did things, like Faith was just furniture, part of how the house was arranged. "That's exactly what it was," he said, "and I didn't understand until I was an adult how rare that is. How hard it is to make Faith feel like furniture instead of like a performance." I think I inherited Rosa's faith the way I inherited her quilts, Delia said. It's real, and it's mine, and I love it, but I'm not sure I've ever really sat down in it, like it was mine to sit down in. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I think you're sitting down in it right now. She thought about that for the rest of the hike. He drove her home in the late morning, the truck full of companionable silence and the smell of river air and sunscreen. When he dropped her off, he said he was glad she'd come. In the plain way he said things, and she said she was glad too, and she got out of the truck and went inside. She stood in the hallway and looked at herself in Rosa's oval mirror, the one where she had practiced her first day of school faces as a small girl, the one that had held her reflection through every version of herself she'd tried on in this house. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with the slightly startled expression of someone who had just been seen clearly for the first time in a while. She stayed there for a moment, looking. She was not sure she recognized everything she saw. But she was, she thought, beginning to be curious about it rather than afraid. That was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Chapter 9. Sylvia. She went on a Wednesday morning. She did not tell anyone she was going. Not Becca, not Tomás, not Marcus. This was not something she could carry to the door with other people's words in her ears. She needed to arrive with nothing but what was already in her, which felt simultaneously like very little and like more than enough. She drove south on State Road 68 with the windows up and the radio off. The high desert moved past her in its steady way, red mesa and juniper and the wide pale sky that New Mexico kept overhead like a certain kind of promise. She passed the spot where the road curved and the San Francisco de Asís church appeared, and she did not slow down this time. She had done her slowing down. She drove past it with her eyes forward and her hands steady on the wheel. She had found the address easily enough. The same search that had found the faculty page had, with one more step, found a street address in Ranchos de Taos that matched the name. She had written it on a piece of paper and put the paper in her pocket and had not looked at it again because she had memorized it immediately, the way you memorize the things you are afraid of. The house was on a short street off the main road, set back behind a low wooden fence with a gate that stood open. Adobe, like most things out here, with a red metal roof and a small garden along the front wall where someone had planted marigolds and something purple she didn't know the name of. A wind chime hung near the front door, copper and patient, turning in the June air. A welcome mat that said nothing except welcome. Delia sat in the car for 2 minutes. Then she got out. She was halfway up the front path when the door opened, and Sylvia Montoya was standing in the doorway before Delia had finished deciding what her face should be doing. She was shorter than Delia had expected. 60 felt too old for this woman who stood in her doorway in a blue linen shirt and reading glasses, pushed up on her head with a compact self-possession of someone who had spent decades learning how to take up the right amount of space. Her hair was mostly gray, cut short, and her eyes, dark, direct, slightly too bright, moved over Delia's face with the expression of someone completing a recognition that had started long before this moment. Neither of them spoke for a breath. Then Sylvia said quietly, "I know who you are." It was not a question. "Yes," Delia said. Sylvia stepped back from the door and held it open, and Delia walked in. The house smelled of coffee and candle wax and something faintly herbal. Dried rosemary, maybe, or something from the garden. It was a small house, neat without being stark, the walls holding a few framed photographs and a painting of the Taos Mountains in a style that suggested a local artist and a deliberate life. Books were stacked on every horizontal surface with the unapologetic accumulation of someone who read because they needed to, rather than because it looked good. A small upright piano stood against the far wall with sheet music open on the rack. Something Delia didn't recognize, handwritten notes in the margins. Sylvia led her to the kitchen. She poured coffee without asking, the way people do when they need something to do with their hands, and set the cups on a small table by the window that looked out onto the back garden where more marigolds were doing their work in the morning sun. She sat down across from Delia and held her own cup in both hands and looked at her steadily. "I have thought about this moment for 30 years, she said. "I don't have a speech prepared. I decided a long time ago that if you ever came, I wasn't going to have a speech, because a speech would be for me and not for you." "Okay," Delia said. It was all she had at the moment. "I want to ask how you found out, but that can wait." She paused. "How are you?" The question was so direct and so genuine that Delia felt the back of her throat tighten. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been in Taos for about a month. I found letters in my grandmother's cedar chest. Rosa's letters." She watched Sylvia's face when she said the name. Something moved through it. Not grief exactly, but what sits beside grief. "Rosa was a good woman," Sylvia said. "She was the reason She stopped, began again. "She made it possible for me to believe I was doing the right thing instead of just the only thing." "Tell me," Delia said. So Sylvia told her. She told it without ornamentation or self-pity, in the plain voice of someone who had rehearsed honesty, rather than a particular version of events. She had been 29, Delia's exact age, a fact she named directly, watching Delia's face when she said it. She had been teaching in Albuquerque, newly arrived, no family nearby, and the relationship that had produced the pregnancy had ended before she knew about it. She had not been abandoned dramatically. The man had simply been wrong for her, in a quiet and thorough way that took the pregnancy to fully reveal. She had made the decision to place the baby in adoption, and had made it alone, and had never, in 30 years, decided she had been wrong. She had decided many other things, that she was sorry, that she wished it had been different, that she hoped. But not that she had been wrong. She had known Rosa through a mutual friend. Rosa had come to her, not the other way around, and had sat in Sylvia's apartment and told her about Tomás, who wanted a child and had the kind of heart that could hold one well. She had told Sylvia that she would pray for her every day until the baby arrived and had done exactly that, had sent a letter every month of the pregnancy, and had sent a photograph 6 months after Delia was born, with a note that said only, "She is healthy and loved, and her laugh is your laugh." Sylvia reached into the pocket of her linen shirt and placed a photograph on the table between them. It was the same photograph, or almost. Different moment, same day. Delia as an infant, 6 months old, apparently mid-laugh, caught by whoever held the camera in an instant of pure, uncomplicated joy. On the back, Rosa's handwriting. "Her laugh is your laugh." Delia looked at it for a long time. "I never tried to contact you," Sylvia said. "I want you to know that was a choice I made for you, not for me. It would have been easier for me to reach out. I thought about it many times, but I had made an agreement, and more than that, I believed you deserved to grow up whole, without a question mark following you around." She paused. "I don't know if I was right. I made the best decision I knew how to make." "I know," Delia said. And she did know. She could see it clearly, not easily, not without the complicated weight of everything it had cost, but clearly. This was not a woman who had discarded something. This was a woman who had made an impossible choice at the age Delia was right now, and had carried it with integrity for 3 decades. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She was not ready, and it would have been untrue in its tidiness, and Sylvia, she sensed, would have known the difference. What she said was, "Thank you for telling me." Sylvia nodded. Her eyes were bright, but she did not cry, and Delia respected her for it. The discipline of a woman who had decided this conversation belonged to Delia and was holding herself to that. They sat for a long time after that. They talked about smaller things. The school, the music program Sylvia had spent 15 years building, the fact that Delia taught kindergarten, which produced in Sylvia a smile of such unguarded warmth that Delia had to look at her coffee for a moment. "You were the kind of child," Sylvia said carefully, "that I always hoped you were, from everything I allowed myself to imagine." She stopped. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't," Delia said. "I know," Sylvia said. "I'm glad you did anyway." At 2 hours, Delia stood, and Sylvia walked her to the door. They did not hug. They stood for a moment on the front step with the wind chime turning between them and the marigolds bright in the afternoon light, and Sylvia said, "I won't ask you for anything. I want you to know that. Whatever this is or isn't, it's yours to decide." Delia nodded. She drove north. She made it as far as the San Francisco de Asís church before she had to pull over. She sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the afternoon light doing what it always did to those massive earthen walls, shifting them slowly from pale sand toward amber, toward something almost gold. And she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and wept. Not from sadness, exactly, and not from relief. From the experience of something that has been held in a closed place for a very long time, finally being allowed air. She wept until she was finished. Then she sat up and looked at those walls, 200 years old, made of the same earth they stood on, still standing, and she breathed. The Bible says that God calls each of us by name and tells us we are His. That even when we pass through the waters, through the rivers, through the fire, we will not be consumed, because He is with us and we belong to Him. Delia had known that verse since childhood. She had said it, recited it, held it at the careful distance of the familiar. Sitting in that parking lot, she did not recite it. It arrived, the way things arrive when they finally find the person they were meant for. "You are mine." She sat with it until it felt like the true thing it was. Then she picked up her phone and called Sylvia. It rang 3 times. "Delia," Sylvia said, and the way she said the name, carefully like something held in both hands, made Delia's chest ache in a way she was beginning to understand was not damage, but the feeling of a heart-making room. "Would you like to have lunch sometime?" Delia said. "Not to figure anything out, just lunch." The silence on the other end lasted only a moment. "Yes," Sylvia said. "I would like that, very much." Chapter 10. What Breaks and What Holds. Tomás Vargas arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a blue pickup truck that Delia recognized from 2 blocks away, driving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been rehearsing the next few hours since Albuquerque and was trying to make sure nothing went sideways on the approach. She was sitting on the porch when he pulled in. He was 61 and looked it in the good way, the way of a man who had worked outdoors most of his life and carried the evidence with dignity. His hair had gone fully silver in the last few years. He wore his usual dark jeans, a collared shirt, the worn leather belt with the turquoise buckle that Delia had known since she was small. He got out of the truck slowly and stood looking at the house for a moment before he looked at her. "Mija," he said. "Hi, Dad," she said. He came up the porch steps, and she stood, and he held her the way fathers hold daughters when words have temporarily failed both of them, firmly, without agenda, for long enough to mean it. She let herself be held. She had not realized until this moment how much she had needed someone to do that without requiring anything back. They went inside. She made coffee, and they sat at Rosa's kitchen table, which had held so many of the important conversations of her life, that it seemed to understand its function and hold the space accordingly. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table. Tomás turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at it. "I've been trying to find the right way to start," he said, "since Albuquerque." "There probably isn't one," Delia said. "Just start?" He nodded. He was quiet for a moment longer, and then he said, "Your mother and I, Carmen, we had tried for 3 years, before you." He paused. "We had lost 2 pregnancies. She didn't talk about it much. She wasn't made for talking about the hard things, your mother. She held them quietly and kept going." He looked up briefly. "You got that from her." Delia said nothing. "When Rosa found Sylvia," he said, "when she told us about the possibility, I want you to understand how it felt. It felt like an answer, not a consolation, not a second choice." He set the cup down. "It felt like the thing we had been praying for, arriving from a direction we hadn't anticipated, which, in my experience, is how God usually operates." She looked at him across the table, this man who had taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot and driven her to every school play, and sat in the front row at her college graduation with a paper sign. He had made himself that said her name in letters large enough to be seen from the stage. This man who had kept a secret for 29 years, not from malice, but from the fear of parents who have been given something precious and cannot bear the thought of it becoming complicated. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Not with anger. The anger had burned down to something more workable in the weeks since the Cedar chest. With genuine wanting to know. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because you were ours," he said. Completely, absolutely, from the first minute, and every year that passed, the telling seemed more likely to make you question something that I never wanted you to question. He exhaled slowly. "I know that was wrong. I know it wasn't mine to decide. I have known that for a long time." He looked at her steadily. "I was afraid, and I let the fear make the decision. That is the honest answer." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Which was itself a kind of gift, even if it arrived wrapped in something that hurt. He reached into the chest pocket of his shirt and produced a photograph she had never seen. A man much younger than she knew him, holding an infant against his chest with both arms, in the careful way of someone who has just been handed something he understands is irreplaceable. The man's face was turned down toward the infant. He was not looking at the camera. He was not thinking about the camera. He was not thinking about anything in the world except what he was holding. She took the photograph from him. "From that moment," he said, "I never thought of you as anything but my daughter, not for one single day." His voice held on the last word by a thin margin. She looked at the photograph for a long time, the young father with his whole attention on the child in his arms, the child who did not yet know she was loved, who did not yet know anything, who was simply there and being held, which was, at the beginning of every life, the whole of what was needed. She set the photograph on the table between them and did not give it back. They sat together for another hour, talking and not talking in the easy alternation of people who had shared a table for a lifetime. Nothing was resolved in the way that resolutions announce themselves. But something shifted. The shift of a thing that has been held at a wrong angle, finally being set down properly. It was not painless. It was, nevertheless, right. Tomás was staying at a motel on the north end of town. He had offered to stay at the house, and she had said, not yet, which he accepted without argument, because he understood that some things needed to be approached in stages, and he had always known how to give her room. She walked him to the truck. "I met Sylvia," she said as he opened the door. He stopped, turned to look at her. "We're having lunch next week. she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not jealousy, not hurt. Something more generous than either. Something that looked, if she read it right, like relief. "Good," he said. Just that. Good. She watched him drive away. She went back inside. She was standing in the kitchen trying to decide whether she wanted more coffee or a long walk or simply to sit down somewhere and not make any decisions for a while when her phone buzzed. "Marcus. Thinking about you today. How are you doing?" She stared at the message. There was nothing wrong with the message. It was a kind message, sent by a kind person who was thinking about her, which on any other day would have been uncomplicated to receive. But the day had taken something from her she hadn't budgeted for. The conversation with Tomás had required a sustained openness that had left her scraped down to something raw and thin, and the rawness needed covering, and the nearest available covering was distance. She typed back before she had thought it through. "I'm fine. Just need some space today." It was not the message she meant to send. The message she meant to send was something warmer and more honest. But she sent it before the warmer version arrived and then set the phone face down on the counter and went to the window. He did not respond immediately. When he did, 10 minutes later, it was only, "I'm here when you're ready." 5 words of grace for a message that had not deserved them. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. She moved through the rest of the afternoon with the mechanical competence she had developed for hard days. Made dinner, ate it, washed the dishes, dried them, put them away. Did all the things that needed doing with the efficiency of a person who is using the small tasks to keep the large feelings at a manageable distance. Before bed, she went into Rosa's bedroom. The cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed where it had always sat. She knelt beside it and lifted the lid and let the cedar smell rise around her, that deep, clean, centuries-old smell that had held everything the chest had to give, had kept it safe and dry and waiting for the moment it was needed. The quilts were folded inside again. The letters were stacked in their bundle. The photograph of Sylvia at the hospital lay face up on top. She looked at it in the lamplight. A woman of 29 holding an infant. Her exact age. Her own beginning. She did not close the lid. She left it open and turned off the lamp and went to bed in the dark. And the cedar smell moved through the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be given air. And she breathed it in. And she lay in the dark and thought about her father's face, turned down toward an infant, and Sylvia's photograph in a pocket, and a man who had sent 5 words of grace in return for something that hadn't deserved them. She thought about all the people who had held things for her without her knowing. She was held, she thought, even when she couldn't feel it. Especially then. She closed her eyes. Chapter 11. Iris. She met Iris Treadwell on a Saturday morning that had decided to be beautiful without any apparent effort. Marcus had called the evening before and asked, in the plain way he asked things, whether she would be open to meeting his mother. He said Iris was in Taos for the weekend, that she came up every summer for a few weeks, and that she had heard about Delia. Not everything, just enough, and would like to meet her if Delia was willing. He said it without pressure or orchestration, available for her consideration. She had almost said, "Not yet." She said yes instead, because she was trying, in the deliberate and somewhat effortful way of someone who has identified a pattern they want to change, to say yes to the things that frightened her slightly. It was not a comfortable practice. It was, she was beginning to understand, a necessary one. They met at a cafe on the south side of the plaza, the kind of place that had been there long enough to have a personality. Mismatched chairs, local art on the walls, coffee that arrived in large ceramic mugs that had clearly survived years of use and had the chips to prove it. The morning light came through the front windows and lay across the tile floor in long, warm rectangles, and the smell of the place was the smell of somewhere that took its coffee seriously and its atmosphere not too seriously, which Delia had always found the right combination. Marcus was already there when she arrived, sitting across from a woman who could only be Iris. She was in her early 70s, small and upright, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had been arranged by decades of specific expression into something that communicated warmth before she said a word. She wore a bright blue blouse and small gold earrings, and she was laughing at something Marcus had said when Delia came through the door, and the laugh was full and unself-conscious, and immediately made Delia feel that whatever this morning was going to be, it was going to be all right. Iris stood when she saw her. "Delia," she said, and held out both hands rather than one, which meant she held both of Delia's hands in both of hers for a moment in the greeting of women who mean to communicate something that a standard handshake can't carry. Her eyes were warm and direct, and moved over Delia's face with the full attention of someone who was genuinely interested rather than simply polite. "It is very good to meet you," Iris said. "Sit down. Marcus says the pastries here are worth the consequences." "They are," Delia said, sitting. "I've been making poor decisions about them since I arrived." "Good," Iris said, as though this were the right answer. "I have always believed that pastries fall into the category of things God put here for our comfort, and we should let them do their job." Marcus caught Delia's eye across the table with an expression that said, "You see what I grew up with." She did. She also understood, within approximately 4 minutes of sitting across from Iris Treadwell, that Marcus was exactly who he was because of this woman, that his particular combination of groundedness and warmth and the ability to sit with hard things without flinching had not arrived by accident, but had been built, carefully and with great love, by the person across the table who was now considering the pastry selection with the seriousness it deserved. They talked easily for the first half hour about surface things: Taos, the cafe, Delia's kindergartners, Iris's work as a retired school administrator who still consulted because, as she said, retirement had turned out to be a concept she respected more in theory than in practice. She had Marcus's quality of making conversation feel like actual exchange rather than performance, and Delia found herself talking more freely than she had intended to about the classroom, about Oscar in the green sweatshirt, about the privilege and weight of being the adult a 5-year-old trusted completely. Iris listened to all of it with the focus of someone who understood children and the people who shaped them. Then, at a natural pause, she set down her coffee cup and looked at Delia in a way that was gentle and direct in equal measure. "Marcus told me a little about what you've been carrying this summer," she said. "Not details. That's yours. Just enough for me to understand." She paused. "I hope it's all right that I say something about it." "Please," Delia said. Iris was quiet for a moment, the way she seemed to gather things before she said them, making sure she was sending what she meant to send. "The day I got the call that Marcus was mine," she said, "I sat in my kitchen for a long time before I did anything else. I was 40 years old. I had been praying for a child for 7 years, and when the call finally came, I didn't jump up and shout, the way I'd always imagined I would." She smiled slightly. "I just sat there, because it was so much bigger than I had managed to prepare for. The thing you've been waiting for, when it actually arrives, it's always larger than the waiting." Delia was very still. "I told Marcus from the beginning who he was," Iris continued, "not who he came from, who he was. I told him that God had known him before he was knit together, had planned for him before the world began, There's a passage in Ephesians I read to him so many times he could say it before he could read, about being chosen before the foundation of the world, adopted as a son, fully an heir. She paused. I never wanted him to feel like a chapter in someone else's story. I wanted him to know he was the main event in God's. She said it without grandeur or performance, the way she seemed to say everything, as simple fact, as settled truth, as furniture. Delia thought about what Marcus had said in the studio, weeks ago. Iris had practically written it into the walls. She understood now exactly what he meant, and she understood how a child raised by this woman had arrived at adulthood, knowing who he was. You did well, Delia said, which was inadequate and true. Iris smiled. He made it easy. He always wanted to know who he was. Some children do. She looked at Delia with the same warm directness. I think you're one of them. Marcus had gone to the counter to refill the coffees. She understood now that he had planned this, had given them this window deliberately, had the thoughtfulness of a man raised by a woman who had taught him what thoughtfulness actually meant. I've spent my whole summer trying to find out where I came from, Delia said. Thinking that would tell me who I am. And, Iris said. And I found out where I came from, Delia said. And I still don't. I'm not sure it answered the question I was actually asking. Iris nodded, as though this was entirely expected. It rarely does, she said, because it isn't the right question. Where you came from is geography. Who you are is something else entirely. Marcus returned with the coffee and settled back into his chair and did not ask what they had been talking about, which was the right call. After breakfast, she drove to the church. She had not planned to. She had planned to go back to the house and sit with everything the morning had given her and let it settle, but she found herself turning into the church parking lot without quite deciding to, the way you sometimes go where you need to go before you have consciously identified the need. Pastor Damon's truck was in the lot. She found him in his office, a small room off the main hall that smelled of old books and printer paper, doing something at his desk that he set aside immediately when she appeared in the doorway, with the manner of a man who had decided a long time ago that whatever was at his desk was less important than whoever was at his door. Delia, he said, come in, sit down. She sat, she told him, haltingly at first, and then with more ease, what the summer had been. The chest, the letters, Sylvia, Tomás, Marcus, Iris. He listened without interruption, without the small editorial reactions some people offered. The winces, the sympathetic sounds, the performances of concern that were more about the listener than the speaker. He listened, cleanly and completely, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing she'd not quite managed to say to anyone yet. I don't know if I've ever had faith that was really mine, she said, or if I've just been wearing Rosa's, wearing what I was handed and calling it belief. She paused. I say the right things. I know the right verses. But somewhere in the last few years, it became something I performed rather than something I lived, and I don't know when that happened or how to go back. She was not sure what she expected. Reassurance, perhaps? A corrective? A verse offered like a bandage? Pastor Damon nodded slowly. Inherited faith has to become owned faith at some point, he said. That's not a failure of the inheritance. It's just what faith requires. It can't stay borrowed forever. He paused. And that moment, the moment when you realize you've been performing it rather than living it, that moment usually looks exactly like what you're sitting in right now. She absorbed that. The good news, he said, is that you're not starting over. You're starting from. There's a difference. He leaned forward slightly. Everything Rosa gave you, everything you learned, every verse you know. That's not wasted because it went quiet for a while. It's been waiting. It's been in the chest, if you want to think of it that way. And you open the chest. The cedar smell, the letters, the photograph. Her laugh is your laugh. She pressed her lips together and breathed. The Bible talks about being known completely, she said, almost to herself. Psalm 139, knit together, seen, known before a single day arrived. She had been carrying that passage since the second morning in the house, when it had surfaced from childhood, like something that had been waiting for the right conditions to rise. I've known that passage my whole life. I'm only just starting to believe it. That's the whole journey, Pastor Damon said. Right there. That's all of it. She drove home through the Taos afternoon, past the plaza with its old cottonwoods and its easy permanence, past the road that led south toward Ranchos to Taos, and a blue sedan, and a woman she was having lunch with on Tuesday. The mountains held their positions above the town with the reliable authority she had been drawing on all summer without quite acknowledging it. She was not starting over. She was starting from. She held that in both hands the whole drive home. Chapter 12. The apology she didn't rehearse. She went to the studio on a Monday. She had not called ahead. She had decided, somewhere between waking up and her second cup of coffee, that calling ahead would give her time to construct the conversation in advance, and she had spent enough of the summer constructing things in advance. She put on her shoes and drove north through the Taos morning with the windows down and the chamisa along the road moving in a light wind and the mountains doing their steady work in every direction. The studio door was open. She stood in it for a moment before he noticed her. He was at the wheel, working in the full absorption she recognized from the first time, his hands on the clay, his attention complete, the whole room holding the quiet of someone doing the thing they were made to do. The morning light lay across the work tables and the shelves of drying pieces, and the row of small clay crosses that had been replenished since her first visit, a new batch waiting for whatever hands needed them next. He looked up. She said, "I owe you an apology." He turned off the wheel. He did not say anything yet, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he gave words room to land before he sent more words after them. "I was rude to you after my dad left," she said. "You sent a kind message, and I sent back something cold. And I want you to know that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with me, which I understand is not an original excuse, but it happens to be the true one." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to apologize for needing space." "I know," she said. "I'm apologizing for the way I asked for it." He accepted that with a small nod, the way he accepted most things. Without theater, without making her earn the grace twice. She came in and sat on her usual stool, and he washed his hands at the utility sink and came and sat across from her on the stool he pulled from under the work table. And they were quiet for a moment in the easy way that had developed between them over the summer. The silence that meant neither of them needed to fill the space, that the space itself was fine. "How are you?" he said. "Actually..." She looked at him. He was asking the question the way Pastor Damon asked questions, as a real inquiry, not a courtesy, an opening rather than a formality. She had been answering that question all summer with the managed version of the truth edited for palatability and emotional efficiency, the truth as she wished it were, rather than as it sat. "I'm better," she said. "Genuinely, I think I'm coming out the other side of something. Or at least I can see the other side from where I'm standing, which is more than I could say a month ago." She paused. "But I'm also... There's a thing I do when I start to feel better that I'm trying to stop doing." "What thing?" "I pull back," she said. "When something starts to feel real and good, I find a way to manage it. Create distance. Put glass between myself and the thing before it can—" She stopped. "Before it can what?" he said. She looked at the row of clay crosses on the shelf. Crooked, handmade, each one different. None of them pretending to be anything other than what they were. "Before it can see me clearly and find something wrong," she said. The words arrived without the careful scaffolding she usually built around the honest things. They came, plain and unadorned, and she let them sit in the air between them without reaching back to qualify them. He was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." "The day you walked into that church courtyard," he said, "and I almost took you out with a stack of cardboard." The corner of his mouth moved. "I noticed you before I saw you," which sounds like a strange thing to say. "What I mean is I noticed the way you were standing, at the edge of things, watching but not quite in, like someone who was deciding whether they were allowed to be there." She did not say anything. "I know that posture," he said. "I wore it for years, standing at the edge of rooms, deciding if I qualified." He paused. "I want you to know that from where I was standing, on the first day and every day since, you qualify, fully, without conditions or asterisks or a probationary period." He said it plainly as a statement of fact, the way he said the things that mattered most. "There is nothing wrong with what I see when I see you, Delia." I want to say that clearly, so you have actually heard it. She looked at him for a moment. She had been braced, she realized, for something more complicated. For a response that required managing. Instead, he had said the true thing in plain language and left it there for her to pick up or set down as she chose, and the simplicity of it was more disarming than anything elaborate could have been. "I'm not good at this," she said. "Being seen. I can be known in sections. Becca knows this part, my dad knows that part, but the whole thing, all at once?" She shook her head slightly. "I know," he said. "I've watched you manage it all summer." She looked up. "Not critically," he said quickly. "I understood it. I noticed." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. I'm just telling you that the managing isn't necessary. Not with me." The studio held its warm, mineral silence around them. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the dirt road, and the dust it raised drifted past the window and settled. "My engagement ended 2 years ago," she said, which she had not told him, and which came out now because the managing was down and the true things were surfacing. "I handled it very well, according to everyone who observed me handling it. I said the right things and felt the right amount and kept going, and somewhere in the middle of handling it very well, I stopped letting anything be real. I just maintained." He nodded. "Maintained my job," she said. "Maintained my church attendance. Maintained my friendships at a comfortable depth." She paused. "I didn't realize how far I'd pulled back until I got here. Until the chest, until—" She gestured slightly, meaning the studio, the gorge trail, the farmer's market, all of it. "Until someone kept showing up without requiring anything," he said. She looked at him. "That's what Iris did for me," he said. "She just kept showing up. She didn't require me to be resolved or certain or finished. She just stayed in the room." He held her gaze. "I'm good at staying in rooms." She believed him entirely. "I'm afraid of how much I like talking to you," she said, which was the most directly she had said it, which was to say she had not said it at all until this moment. "I'm not," he said. Without performance, looking right at her. She breathed. They sat in the studio for another hour, talking without the careful architecture of managed conversation about his work, her classroom, Iris's most recent piece of unsolicited life advice, which had been delivered by text and had included 2 exclamation points and a reference to Proverbs that she had looked up and found entirely apt. He made her laugh twice in the way she had come to expect, the laugh that arrived before she decided to allow it. She told him about the lunch with Sylvia, which had happened the week before, which she had not yet told him about. How they had sat in a restaurant in Ranchos de Taos for 2 hours and talked mostly about music and teaching and the strangeness of New Mexico summers, carefully at the comfortable edge of something that was not yet close, but was no longer far. "How did it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like the beginning of something I don't have a word for yet," she said. "Not mother, not stranger. Something that will probably need its own name eventually." "That's okay," he said. "Things don't have to be named to be real." The afternoon was making itself known by the time they left the studio, the light gone from morning gold to the longer, slower gold of a Taos afternoon that knew it was the best part of the day and was taking its time. He suggested the plaza, and she said yes, and they walked the 2 blocks from where they'd parked and found the old cottonwoods doing their patient work over the benches, the mountains visible above the portal roofline, the town going about its evening business with the ease that Taos had always had, the ease of a place that understood it was already where everyone wanted to be. They walked the portal and the talk kept going the way it did when neither person wanted it to stop, moving in the widening circles that she had come to recognize as their conversational shape, covering more ground with each loop. The light changed around them from gold to amber to the first lavender suggestion of evening, and still they walked, and still they talked. She told him about being a child in this town, the summers with Rosa, the farmer's market with its green chile and its lavender, the church with the mismatched pews, Frances in the second row with her rosewater and her pointed finger. He told her about being 17 in Taos, restless and clay-handed, beginning to understand that what he made with his hands was also somehow what he was making of himself. They talked about faith the way she had not talked about faith in years, not as performance or obligation, but as the actual texture of their lives, the thing that shaped how they moved through the world, even when they couldn't see it operating. The stars arrived while they were still walking. She noticed them incrementally, one, then several, then the full Taos night, opening up above the plaza with its characteristic extravagance, the kind of sky that made you understand why people had been finding God in it since the beginning of human looking. They stopped at the corner of the plaza where the path turned back toward the parking area. She was aware, in the specific way you are aware of the end of something good, that the evening was nearly finished. He turned to face her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Would you have dinner with me this week?" he said. Not as a walk that extended into the evening, or 2 people who happened to be at the same cafe. A proper dinner. Where I pick you up, and we go somewhere that isn't our usual somewhere, and I tell you in advance that I'm glad you said yes. She looked at him in the starlight. The Taos night was very quiet around them, the plaza holding its ancient, easy silence. She was not afraid. She noticed the absence of it specifically, the way you notice a sound that has stopped, the managing, the glass, the careful maintenance of distance. She looked for them, and they were not in their usual positions. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." His smile was the honest, uncomplicated one she had come to know, the one that didn't announce itself or ask for anything back. They said goodnight. She drove home with both windows down and the night air moving through the car, warm and sage-scented and full of the quality of a summer night that has been exactly right. She did not try to manage the feeling. She let it be what it was, uncomplicated and real and just beginning, which was the best thing a feeling could be. At the house, She went inside and stood in the hallway and looked at herself in Rosa's oval mirror. She recognized the woman looking back. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. She smiled at her a little. Then she went to call Becca because some things were too good not to tell someone immediately, and Becca had been waiting for this phone call since approximately the second Sunday in June. Chapter 13. San Francisco de Asís. She went on a Thursday morning before anyone else was awake. She had not planned the day or the hour. She had simply opened her eyes at 5:45 into the gray blue of a Taos morning that hadn't committed to dawn yet, and she had known, with the quiet certainty of something already decided, that she was going to the church. She dressed without turning on a light and drove south on State Road 68 with the road entirely to herself, and the sky beginning its slow conversation with the sun along the eastern mountains. She had been to San Francisco de Asís 100 times. She had driven past it and slowed down and pulled over and wept in its parking lot and called Sylvia from its shadow. She had seen it in every light the New Mexico day produced. She had seen it the way O'Keeffe had seen it, as a thing so completely itself that it seemed less built than grown, less made than revealed. The earth simply rising into the shape of what it had always meant to be. She had never gone inside alone. The church was unlocked, the way it was always unlocked in the early hours, the way things that belong to everyone are left open for whoever needs them. She pushed the heavy wooden door and stepped in and stood for a moment while her eyes adjusted. The interior was cool and still and smelled of adobe and old wood, and the faint sweetness of candles burned down to nothing and replaced so many times over so many years that the smell had become part of the walls themselves. The light inside at this hour was the light of a place not yet asked to perform, soft and directionless, coming from windows set deep in walls that were 4 feet thick in places, walls that had been standing since 1815 and before that in earlier forms, going back further still. Walls that had absorbed 2 centuries of prayer the way Cedar absorbed the smell of what it kept. She walked to a pew near the front and sat down. She did not bow her head immediately. She sat upright and looked at the altar and the wooden cross above it and the high walls with their gentle curve, and she let the silence of the place do what silence in old churches does: accumulate, deepen, become its own kind of presence. She had told Pastor Damon she didn't know if she'd been praying to anyone or just rehearsing. She had told Becca she didn't know how to pray anymore. She had meant both of those things, and they had been true when she said them, and somewhere between then and this morning they had become slightly less true, and she had come here to find out how much less. She thought about everything the summer had given her, the cedar chest and the smell of it opening, Rosa's handwriting on an envelope addressed to a granddaughter she never quite found the courage to give the truth to, which was a human failure and also a human love. Tomás's face turned down toward an infant, not thinking about the camera, not thinking about anything but what he was holding. Sylvia at her kitchen table with a photograph in her pocket. Becca in the backyard with the solar lights and the stars, saying the things Delia hadn't been able to say herself. Marcus at the wheel with his whole attention on the clay, Iris holding both hands. Pastor Damon in his office that smelled of old books, saying, "You're not starting over, you're starting from." She thought about all of it. Then she stopped thinking and simply sat. The morning light was finding the windows now, the deep-set windows in those thick walls, and the quality of the light inside was beginning to shift. Not bright yet, but present. The way a person is present when they have been waiting quietly and are glad you finally arrived. She had known, since she was 4 years old, that the Bible said she was knit together in a secret place, that every part of her had been seen and named and written down before a single day of her life had come to pass. She had known that Scripture says we are chosen before the foundation of the world, adopted as God's own children, full heirs rather than afterthoughts, wanted rather than accommodated. She had known that God had told the prophet he was known before he was formed, set apart before he was born. She had known that Hagar alone in the desert had looked up and found herself seen by a God who had come to find her there. She had known that God calls each of us by name, claims us as his own, promises to be with us through the waters and the fire and the places where the ground gives way. She had known all of it. She had kept it at the careful distance of the familiar, the way you keep furniture you've had so long you've stopped seeing it, the way you wear a coat for years without feeling its weight. She felt the weight of it now. It settled over her in that cool adobe interior, the way warmth settles when you come in from the cold, gradually, and then fully, and then with the physical quality of something real. Not a feeling she had generated, not a mood she had talked herself into. Something received, the way Becca had said identity was received, the way Marcus had said Iris gave him not the facts of his origin, but the truth of who he was. She closed her eyes. She did not have prepared language. She had spent a summer finding out that prepared language was another form of management, and she was done managing. She said, simply and without architecture, "I'm here. I know you know that. I'm just..." saying it, out loud, in a room that's heard a lot of people say it. She stayed with that for a moment. Then, "I think I've been afraid that if I let this be real, really real, not performed, not borrowed, I would find out it wasn't, that the faith would turn out to be another thing I thought I knew and didn't." She paused. "But I've spent this whole summer finding out that things I thought I knew were truer than I understood. Not less true. More." The light in the windows had gone from present to warm. Outside she could hear, very faintly, the first sounds of a morning beginning. A bird, a distant car, the world starting its ordinary work. "Rosa knew who I was before I did," she said. "Tomás knew. Sylvia, in her way, knew. And the Bible says, you knew before any of them, before I was anything at all. You already knew." She breathed. "I want to know it the way you mean it, not from the outside of it, from inside." She sat in the quiet that followed. It did not feel like silence. It felt like the kind of listening you can only do when you have finally stopped talking. The kind that requires you to put down everything you carried in and simply be in the room. She was in the room. She was fully, actually in the room, with no glass between herself and what the room contained. She did not hear a voice. She did not need one. What she had was the settling of something that had been slightly wrong for a long time, finding its right position. The small internal click of a thing coming into alignment, not dramatic, not sudden, but real in the way of things that have been true all along and have simply been waiting for you to stop arguing with them. She sat until the church began to fill with proper morning light, the sun fully up now and doing what it did to the inside of those thick walls, warming the adobe, shifting the color of the air from blue-gray to something almost gold, making the old wood of the pews glow with the gentle luster of something well-made and long-used and still entirely sound. She sat until she was finished, which was not a feeling she had expected to be able to identify, but which turned out to be unmistakable. The completion of something rather than the ending of it. The way a sentence feels different from an ellipsis. She stood, she walked to the door and pushed it open and stepped out into the Taos morning, which had gone fully golden now, the Sangre de Cristo range lit along its whole length, the sage below the church lit from within, the sky above it a blue so deep and clear it looked intentional. She stood on the step for a moment and breathed it all in. Then she took out her phone and called Sylvia. "I'm in Ranchos to Taos," she said when Sylvia answered. "Have you had breakfast?" A pause, then warmly, "Not yet." "Good," Delia said. "Neither have I." Chapter 14. Everything the Cedar kept. The last Sunday of July arrived the way the best Sundays do. Without fanfare, without any particular announcement that it intended to be significant, simply showing up in the ordinary way of mornings and allowing what was going to happen. Delia was ready early. She stood in front of Rosa's oval mirror in a white dress she had bought at a small shop off the plaza the previous week, on a whim that had not felt like a whim, and she looked at herself for a moment the way she had been learning to look, without the audit, without the inventory of insufficiencies, just looking. The woman in the mirror looked back at her steadily, present, recognizable. Hers. She went to church. The morning was the blue and gold of a late July Taos day that had not yet remembered to be hot, the air still carrying the overnight cool, the mountains sharp-edged against a sky that had nothing to apologize for. She drove with the windows down and her hand resting on the door and the sage smell coming through the car, and she thought, as she had been thinking since Thursday morning in that cool adobe interior, that this was what it felt like to be inside your own life, rather than adjacent to it. The parking lot was full in the comfortable way of a congregation that had been coming to this place long enough to know where it belonged. Becca had driven up the night before, arriving just after dark with the easy confidence of someone who had determined this Sunday was not optional and had not mentioned it until she was already an hour outside Albuquerque. Delia had found her on the porch with a cup of tea and no particular apology. Marcus was waiting near the bougainvillea wall. He was wearing a collared shirt she hadn't seen before, dark blue, and his arms were clean of clay, which she understood was an occasion-specific effort and appreciated accordingly. He smiled when he saw her, the honest, uncomplicated smile she had come to know. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early," he said. "I just usually have boxes to carry, so it looks purposeful." She laughed, and they went in together. The congregation gathered around them with the warmth of a community that had known Rosa Vargas and had therefore been predisposed toward her granddaughter from the beginning, and Delia moved through it differently than she had on that first Sunday in June. Not at the edge of things, not watching from the careful distance of someone deciding whether she was allowed. She was in it. Frances, in the second pew, caught her eye and pointed, as she always did, and this time Delia pointed back, which produced in Frances an expression of such delight that Elena Reyes, watching from across the room, laughed into her coffee. Tomás was in the fourth row. He had stayed in Taos longer than he'd planned, which neither of them had discussed directly, and both of them understood. He turned when she came in, and his face did the thing it had done since she was small. The softening of a father who has just seen his child and is glad. She slid into the pew beside him, and he put his arm around her briefly, and she leaned into it briefly, and that was enough. That was the whole of what needed to be said between them this morning. Becca was on his other side, which meant she had texted Tomás to coordinate seating, which was characteristic and not worth addressing. She caught Delia's eye over Tomás's shoulder and raised her eyebrows once toward Marcus, who was settling into the pew on Delia's other side. Delia gave her a look that said, "Behave yourself." Becca's expression said, "I always behave myself," which was the least accurate sentence her face had ever communicated. Iris Treadwell was 2 rows ahead, sitting in the pew the way she did everything, fully, attentively, with the posture of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be and intended to be present for all of it. She turned before the service started and found Delia and smiled. The warm and direct smile of a woman who had held both of someone's hands on a first meeting and meant it. And Delia smiled back. Pastor Damon preached from Romans 8, the passage Becca had quoted in the backyard under the stars, about the spirit of adoption, about being called not to fear, but to belonging, about the cry of a child to a father who was actually there, actually listening, actually close. He preached it the way he preached everything, without notes and without hurry, in the plain language of someone who had lived with a truth long enough to know it didn't need decoration. Delia listened with her whole self. She did not manage it or hold it at arm's length or perform the receiving of it. She let it land where it landed, which was somewhere deep and settled, somewhere that felt like the interior of an old church at first light, cool and still, and full of the accumulated weight of many years of the same thing being true. At some point during the service, she became aware, in the peripheral way, of a figure standing near the back wall. She did not turn immediately. When she did, during the final song, she saw Sylvia Montoya standing just inside the door in a pale green blouse, holding a bulletin she had clearly been given at the entrance and had not yet opened, looking at the congregation with the expression of someone who had not been inside a church in a long time and was finding it less frightening than expected. She was near the back, not claiming space she hadn't been given, simply present, which was, Delia thought, exactly right for where they were. She had invited her on Thursday over breakfast, quietly without pressure. "You don't have to stay the whole time," she had said. "You don't have to do anything. You can just come." She had come. Delia turned back to face forward. She did not reach any grand conclusion about what that meant or what it would become. It would become what it would become, in the slow and careful way of things that were being built honestly, rather than hurried toward resolution. There was no word for what Sylvia was to her yet. There would be, eventually. She was in no rush. After the service, the congregation moved into the courtyard, and the morning opened up around them. Coffee and biscochitos, and the mountains above the wall, and the bougainvillea, doing its patient work on the corner. All of it exactly as it had been on the first Sunday in June, and entirely different. Delia made her way to the back of the room. Sylvia was still near the door, as though she hadn't quite decided whether she was staying or going. She looked up when Delia approached, and something in her expression shifted, the careful brightness of a woman who was holding more than she was showing, which was a thing they had, Delia was beginning to understand, in common. "Thank you for coming," Delia said. "Thank you for asking," Sylvia said. They stood for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable moment. It was the moment of two people who were at the beginning of something slow and true and were both willing to let it be slow, which was itself a kind of agreement. "Come have coffee," Delia said. "There are biscochitos. They go fast." She paused. "We're all going back to the house afterward, if you'd like to come. Nothing formal, just people. Becca makes a lot of noise, and my dad is very quiet, and it balances out." Sylvia's smile was small and real. "All right," she said. They went out into the courtyard together. Tomás was near the coffee table, and he looked up when they came through the door, and his face did something complicated and careful and ultimately generous that Delia watched and filed away and would think about for a long time. He nodded once at Sylvia. She nodded once at him. It was not a reunion, and it was not nothing. It was two people acknowledging 30 years of a shared history neither of them had chosen and both of them had carried, and doing it with dignity, which was all anyone could reasonably ask. Becca appeared at Delia's elbow within approximately 4 seconds and introduced herself to Sylvia with the warmth and complete lack of awkwardness of someone who had decided in advance that this was going to be fine and had communicated that decision to the universe. Iris found Sylvia within the next 5 minutes, because of course she did. Delia stood for a moment at the edge of the courtyard and looked at the people who had gathered here. Tomás with his coffee and his quiet relief. Becca talking to Sylvia with her hands the way she always talked. Iris with her gold earrings and her full attention. Pastor Damon and Elena moving through the crowd with the ease of people who understood that their job was mostly just to be present. Frances in her usual spot near the biscochitos. The teenagers along the sidewall still working out whether any of this was relevant to them. All of these people had showed up. In different ways, at different times, for different reasons. But they had showed up, and they were here, and the morning was holding all of it without any apparent strain. Marcus came to stand beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. They stood together at the edge of the courtyard, the way they had stood together at the edge of the gorge, looking at the same thing, in no particular hurry. "How are you?" he said, and she heard in it the same real inquiry he always meant. "I'm good," she said. And then, because she was done with the managed versions, "I'm really good, Marcus, actually." He looked at her with the direct, steady look that had seen her clearly since the beginning and found what it saw to be entirely fine. "Good," he said. The word as its own complete sentence, carrying more than its 4 letters suggested. He reached over and took her hand with the easy certainty of someone who had decided something and was not making a production of it. His hand was warm and slightly rough from the clay and entirely sure of itself, and she held it back without managing the feeling or putting glass between herself and it, just held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. "Still on for dinner Tuesday?" he said. "Still on for dinner Tuesday," she said. They stood in the Taos morning with the mountains above the wall and the coffee going around and the people she loved gathered in the same courtyard, talking and laughing and being quietly, ordinarily holy, in the way of people who had chosen to show up for each other. And she held his hand and did not look for reasons to let go. Later, after Tomás had driven back toward Albuquerque with his windows down and the radio on, and Becca had stayed through the afternoon and monopolized Sylvia for the better part of 2 hours in a way that Sylvia had seemed to find more delightful than exhausting, and the house had been full, and then gradually less full, and then finally quiet in the way of a house that has held people well and is now resting. Delia went to Rosa's bedroom. She knelt beside the cedar chest. She lifted the lid. The cedar smell rose around her, clean and deep and patient. The smell of something that had kept its contents faithfully through every season, that had held the quilts and the photographs and the letters and the truth at the bottom of all of it, waiting without judgment for the morning that someone would be ready. She looked inside for a long moment. Then, gently, she lowered the lid. The latch turned with the small sound of old brass finding its position, settled and right, the sound of a thing that had finished what it was made to do. She stayed kneeling for a moment with her hand flat on the warm cedar surface. She was Rosa's granddaughter, with Rosa's faith finally inhabiting her bones rather than sitting politely in the parlor. She was Tomás's daughter, chosen and held and named by a man who had turned his face toward her and never looked away. She was a teacher and a friend, and the woman Marcus Treadwell was taking to dinner on Tuesday, which was a fact she intended to be happy about without qualification. She was a child of God, not borrowed, not inherited, not performed, but claimed before the foundation of the world by a love that had been chasing her through a Taos summer with the patient confidence of something that already knew how the story ended. She was, perhaps, at the earliest stages of knowing someone named Sylvia Montoya, which had no name yet and would have one eventually, and was already, in its quietness and its care, something real. She carried all of it. It was more than she had walked into this house with 6 weeks ago. It was more than she had known how to carry 6 weeks ago. She understood. kneeling on the floor of her grandmother's bedroom in the lamplight with the smell of cedar rising around her, that this was what the summer had been for. Not to answer every question, but to show her that she was the kind of person who could hold more than she thought. Rosa had always thought so. She was beginning to think so too. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed in the dark, and the mountain stood where it always stood, and the desert held its deep summer silence. And in the morning the sun would come across the Sangre de Cristo range in the way it had always come, and the sage would light from within, and the hollyhocks would be exactly where they were, and she would wake up in this house that smelled of pignon and old wood and cedar, and the sweetness of a life lived slowly and well. And she would be ready. Thank you for spending some time with us, listening, reflecting, and resting in God's endless love. If this story touched you, encouraged you, or brought a moment of peace, I'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like. It helps our uplifting stories reach more hearts. If you'd like to join us for more grace-filled tales, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until we meet again in the next story, may you carry His grace with you, one gentle step at a time. Simply Grace Audio. Simple stories, endless grace.